Well, hello again. Welcome to Mr. Devil's Tales. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Skinwalker encounter stories. First story. My Skinwalker story. Arizona. Okay, so to start out, I live in Mesa, Arizona, which is basically Phoenix, Arizona, because the main cities of Arizona spread out into many sites with no border in between. Mesa is what I would call the suburbs of Phoenix. I changed my name, of course. I live in an apartment complex I would describe as close to the ghetto but still nice. I live in a bedroom, one bathroom apartment with my girlfriend. Arizona is a state full of ancient Native American history. I live next to a Hohokam Canal, as do many Arizonians. The whole place used to be cities of ancient Native Americans. The point is, I'm in the area for what I believe to be a skinwalker. I'll get to my story. Yesterday, I was drinking, one of the things I picked up during the COVID-19 quarantine, or what's enforced here. And I decided to smoke a bowl on my apartment patio, which I don't usually do, mind you. I just finished loading up my pipe and taking the first hit when I hear a voice, somewhere nearby. "Amanda, open the door please." It was a young, probably in the 20s girl's voice talking, and it sounded calm and teasing. It continued on as I tried to ignore it, smoking my last bud. After about 4 times of it repeating itself, my curiosity caused me to look for the source. I saw in an apartment building facing across from me movement. I saw a dog standing on its hind legs, leaning on a door, tapping. At first I shrugged, of course. Then I hear the voice again. It sounded exactly the same as last time. Exactly the same, as if you record their voice in that sentence and replayed it once again. There wasn't any other sound or movement in the complex. I watched the thing knock on Amanda's door for like 30 seconds in what I would call a state of shock and curiosity. Then it stopped and didn't move for another 20 seconds. Until the dog thing stood all the way up, away from the doorway, on its hind legs, and turned to face me. It made eye contact with me. Which is weird because we were at least 50 yards away. I'm on the 3rd floor, it's on the 2nd, but I felt it looking at me. I held its eye contact. I was so scared. I felt like I should run. Then it got on all 4s and headed down the stairs slowly. At the bottom it started slowly walking over to me. I was on all 4s now, about to go inside or scream, I don't know. But I had to know what this thing was going to do. It walked close to my balcony. Yes, it was a dog, a brownish yellow, dirty looking thing, with big eyes that were 100% attentive to mine. It didn't seem natural, to be honest, but nothing looked wrong at a glance, except that it was staring into my eyes, and wouldn't stop. I ran inside as it reached the bottom of my stairs and locked my doors. Soon I heard clawing at my door, doggy clawing. Next I heard the door handle jiggle, then it started on my porch door. I of course never answered, instead I hid behind my kitchen counter with a knife. After about 30 minutes it left. I stayed up all night, but I didn't see it again, and I didn't go out again. I'm hoping it doesn't come back. I haven't gone outside at night again. I'm burning sage and trying to be careful as I can. Second story. My grandfather saw a skinwalker. My grandfather told me a story once, as we sat around a campfire in his backyard, in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkled in a purple sky, with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy and gravelly, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide dark eyes, as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age," he began. "I lived outside an Apache reservation, with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war, and set about raising horses and cattle, on 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside, with dirt good for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek, and some old abandoned farmsteads. The fire sparked, and a log cracked, jolting me out of the story. What next?" I asked. "Settle down, boy, you'll hear soon enough." Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember, too, when the engine began to sputter, and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "God damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road, as it coasted to a halt. "Stay here, son," as he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up carrion, like one of them dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat, and lay there, until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk, and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too, the back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get hot. The wind stopped blowing, and hung still and heavy, with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called. "Pa, PA." No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. Boy, I tell you, I never felt fear like this, not until Vietnam, not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door, and reached over for my pa door, and saw a shadow bound across the road, through both dim beams of light, across the partly open domed hood. Grandfather paused. He spit a fat wad of tobacco spit off to his side, and he looked pensively into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath, and gasped for air. The night was cool, but I was sweating and clammy. "Well? What happened? What about your father? What did you see?" He sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand, there were legends, older than the rock cairns out in the valley, older still than Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, than the old Injun chiefs and their shamans. The Apache, and Hapa, and Cherokee, and all them old tribes and First Peoples, they told tales, old stories, about dark Injun magic, a deal made with the old spirits, of blood sacrifice, to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other, and the Spaniards, and later the white men that came for their land and women. They called them." He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath, and bodied forward into his tale. Across the fire, and the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and old mountains, he bodied forward. They called them Skinwalkers. Shape-changers. Old warriors resurrected as skinless men, all sinew and muscle, walking on deer legs, with the torso of a man, and the head of a coyote. But messed up, boy, long and malformed snouts. Teeth like a Bowie knife. Long arms, and standing 7 foot, even hunched over. They'd got the old cowboys, and white riders, they'd run through bullets and sabers, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. Wily too, they could change their voice to match a person you knew, or might know. Boy, that's what I saw. Big, and fast, only for a second, it ran across the road. Gray and mottled. muscle flexing under its legs, hooves clomping on the road, stringy muscled hunched shoulders. And it turned. Looked right into the cab, looked right into my eyes, and I swear, boy, I swear it grinned at me. I sank into my seat, in shock, in fear, shaking. I knew death was near. The air was electric, I smelled ozone, and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes, and blows a tree to smithereens. Charged and full with power. I yelled for my pa, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I was shaking, as grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I know he lived, but the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide. So they could take others. Not for long, the legends say. Maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin they wore would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting my fists up to fend off attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grasped the steering wheel and pulled himself in awkwardly, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. "Boy, your great-grandfather was a good man, treated me and my ma right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your ma," as he pulled the truck into gear, and pulled it out onto the road, and our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. "But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom?" "No, boy, I knew, because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I seen that beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with them yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next us, boy." My pa kept his eyes on the road, locked straight forward. "Son," he said, "don't look at it, don't look at it." That's how I knew, boy. Third story. I think I met a skinwalker. Growing up in Arizona, myths and legends are a part of life. Native traditions, mystic places, vortexes, UFO abductions, and dozens of other stories of the unknown that I always found fascinating. I grew up spending a lot of time wandering around the desert and the mountains, hunting, camping, etc., so I felt very at home in the wilderness. One late spring day on one of my many hiking adventures, I wandered off trail and after several hours came upon a small group of old mud adobe houses. A few people heard me coming and came out of the houses to investigate, and after apparently making the collective decision that I was not a threat, one of the elders dressed in old-style traditional native clothing and a headdress came over to greet me. The man spoke slowly and told me that I had wandered onto a Navajo reservation and asked me if I was lost, or if I needed help. When I told him no, I was lost but intentionally, he chuckled and invited me in to eat with his family. The next several hours were one of the great experiences of my life. The whole thing was like being thrown back in time. While we ate and talked, others from the surrounding houses began coming over to join us, and I got the feeling they didn't get many outside visitors. We shared stories for hours about life, family, fear, history in the area, and time spent in the wild, and the longer we talked, the more they opened up and the more interesting the elders' stories got. Throughout the time, there was one man who never spoke, he just sat out of the circle listening and watching me. At one point, I told them I did what I called my walkabouts every year around September, where I would go out by myself into the wilderness for 2 to 4 weeks at a time, and this got the attention of the one silent old man. When I finished, he came over to the circle around the fire, sat directly on the ground in front of me, and asked me to join him on the ground. He told me that years ago he used to do the same thing, and went on to tell me about the canyon he went to. He described it as a dangerous but magic place, and that I would see the world differently if I came back. If must be for dramatic effect. When he finished, he invited me over to his home. The house was small, and through an open door in the back room, I could see it was filled with various animal pelts, coyotes and wolves mostly. He walked over and closed that door, then picked up and handed me an old map and some written directions that seemed like he had been holding on to them for a long time, and just walked away into that back room and closed the door behind him. It was late, and one of the families had invited me to stay the night, which I gladly did. The next morning, as I prepared to leave, one of the old women came over to me with something in her hands, handed me a talisman and simply said, "Dip your bullets in the white ash at the hottest part of the fire," then just walked away. September came, and as I packed for my walkabout, I saw the talisman in a drawer and something felt right about taking it with me. After a beautiful drive, I was very happy to find the Forest Service road marked on the old map. The entrance to the area was remote and overgrown, and tough to get to even in my Jeep, and took me much longer to get to than expected, so I decided to make camp and start the hike in the morning. After a few hours on a trail that looked like it had been forgotten, I came to a stream, and the entrance to the secret valley. It was a narrow crack in the tall cliffs with about 4 feet of water running gently through, but too narrow for a kayak or canoe. I hoisted my gear over my head and began to wade sideways through the chest-deep water. The crack in the cliffs seemed to go on forever, but after almost 2 hours I came to the place where it opened up into a small lake and an incredible valley surrounded by tall rock faces. This may have been the most remote place I have ever been, in the sense that there was no sign that people had ever been there. No trash, no bullet casings, not even the evidence of campfires. My first night there was the quietest night I have ever spent in the wild. No birds, no frogs, not even crickets, but I didn't feel like I was alone there. In the morning, after breakfast, I headed out on my first exploratory hike to explore my new home for the next couple weeks. After being stalked by a mountain lion on a hike about 10 years ago, I make a point of now bringing a pistol with me when I'm out wilderness hiking. After some looking around, I found a narrow path that appeared to be a game trail that led up the side of one of the cliffs and towards what looked like caves from the canyon floor. I made my way up to them and came upon an entrance that was much larger than it appeared from below. I made some noise to alert any possible animals I was there, and made my way inside. The cave was an expansive single chamber that went back a couple 100 feet. As I walked, I inspected as much as I could see with my light, but there was no tracks of any kind in the dirt besides mine, so I decided I was alone in there and pushed on towards the rear of the cave. As I came around the last bend in the cave and approached the end, my headlamp panned across a large pile of bones, some animal, some human, and a very old-looking, small candle sitting on a natural stone shelf. This is the first thing that has scared me in as long as I can remember, but focusing my wits I remembered that there was no other tracks in the cave and figured it was all from a long time ago. I was still a little uneasy as I exited the cave, and was ready to get back to camp. As I came out into the light, about 75 feet away, there was the largest wolf I have ever seen that looked like it was coming down from standing on its hind legs. It dropped down to all fours on a rock, just began staring at me, not growling or baring its teeth, just staring. I pulled my .45 and fired 2 shots to the side of it to scare it away, but it didn't even flinch. Not only have I never seen a wolf in this part of northern Arizona, but I have never seen a wild animal that did not at least flinch at the sound of a gunshot. We both stood there staring at each other for a moment. I turned and set my backpack down to grab my binoculars and get a little closer look, but when I turned back, the wolf was gone. I made my way cautiously down the path back towards camp. I have encountered wolves before, and usually it's not the one wolf you can see that should worry you, it's the ones you can't see, so I was extra cautious for the return trip. Back at camp, I made sure my gun was fully loaded, and got my recurve bow strung just in case the wolves came back. I have seen plenty of predatory animals on my adventures. It's a part of being in the wilderness, so I wasn't too worried, just prepared myself the best I could and went over to the lake to go fishing. Within about 20 minutes, I caught 2 of the biggest brown trout I've ever caught, so I decided to stop fishing for the day and take a swim. Back at camp, I made a fire, cleaned my trout and made dinner while the sun went down. As soon as the sun went down, all of the life in the canyon seemed to go silent again. As I put out my fire and prepared for bed, I noticed there was a small flicker of light coming from the area where the cave I had explored earlier up the cliffside, which didn't make sense. It was a moonless night, and stars don't reflect that way. It couldn't have been the candle I had seen, it was too old and would not have burned so bright. I decided to keep my gun close and try to get some sleep. I would investigate the cave again the next day. When I woke at sunrise, there was a haze along the ground throughout the whole canyon floor, but as the sun rose it disappeared quickly, and the area came back to life. I made my breakfast, gathered my gun and bow, and headed back up towards the cave. When I reached the entrance, I saw there were still no tracks besides mine around the entrance and decided to push up the hill further. Just a little further up, I came upon the entrance to another cave, much smaller than the first one. There was a small flat landing with a large, heavily twisted juniper tree that to my absolute surprise had many small objects hanging from thin, old-looking ropes tied to the branches. There were bones, but there were also old things definitely made by humans, and looked like they were old Native American artifacts. Thinking I might have found the spot where the old man I met on the reservation had stayed when he was there decades ago, I went into the cave. This cave was much different from the first one. Just a few feet in, I noticed the walls were covered in what looked like ceremonial cave paintings. As I pushed further back, the cave got dramatically colder, much colder than it should have been, and the walls were completely covered with the paintings the entire way. When I reached the back of the cave, I was not prepared for what I saw. There was what looked like an old altar made of wood and bones. As I looked around, I saw that a little before the back of the cave, there was another shaft in the ceiling that went up, and on a ledge about 25 feet up sat the small figure of what appeared to be a woman. She was small and pale with her face painted white, and wearing something like a crown made of woven branches with 2 small antlers at the front. I stopped and stared for a few minutes, and the figure did not move, so I assumed that it was mummified remains from a long time ago. Not wanting to disturb a burial site, I turned to walk back out of the cave, but I began to walk, I heard what sounded like a faint voice in an unknown, ancient language. I instinctively looked back up towards the figure, but it was gone. I was immediately terrified, and ran from the cave as fast as I could get out, but my headlamp flickered and died. I made my way out, feeling along the wall to find my way, and the whole way I felt like there was something right behind me. When I saw the first light from the cave entrance, I began to sprint towards it. Just before I made it out, I looked back and there was nothing, so I slowed down, but I could still hear the faint voice and the volume never changed. When I got outside, all the bones and artifacts hanging from the tree were gone. I ran down the path as fast as I could, headed back to my campsite by the lake. Just as I reached the floor of the canyon, I noticed a large wolf at the tree lean to my left, but this time it stayed standing upright on its hind legs. I stopped running, hoping to not initiate its predatory response to chase me, and again, it just stood there staring at me. I reached my campsite safely and immediately began packing up. It was too late in the day to make it out before dark, and I did not want to make the hike out at night with all that was going on. I moved my tent so it would back up to the canyon wall by the crack in the cliffside so I didn't have to worry about anything sneaking up behind me. I built my fire much larger and knew I wasn't going to get any sleep that night. Just as the sun was going down, I began to hear noises coming from the trees, and I felt like I was being hunted. Finally, in the last light of day, I saw the wolf slowly walking around by where the path led out of the trees, and it began to slowly walk towards me. This time I drew my gun and fired towards the creature intending to hit it, and while I saw a couple hit the dirt around it, several bullets hit it. Several rounds from a .45 will at least slow down anything I've ever encountered, but this giant wolf kept walking towards me like nothing had happened. I continued to fire at it until the inevitable click of an empty magazine. I reached down and fumbled around in my backpack looking for my other magazines to reload, and as I lifted it, the talisman the old woman gave me fell out onto the ground. I picked it up and put it around my neck and immediately remembered what she had told me: dip your bullets in the white ash. I looked around, but didn't see my backup magazines, so I grabbed my bow, pulled an arrow that was tipped with a hunting broadhead and dipped it into the white ashes, drew and fired. I hit the creature just in front of its right hip and it let out a noise somewhere between a growl and a person screaming that made my blood curdle. I can hear that noise in my head to this day. It immediately turned and ran back to the trees, and in the flicker of the firelight I saw the small women with the antler crown standing there waiting for it. They both retreated into the trees, and for the rest of the night, I could hear the same faint voice I had heard in the cave. I spent the night outside of my tent, as awake as I have ever been, but no longer afraid, and at dawn finished packing up so I could get out of that canyon. The next spring, I went back to the small group of houses on the Navajo reservation I had found the year before. I was wearing the talisman as a necklace, and the first person to greet me was the woman who had given it to me, and she ran up to give me a big hug. "You heard me," was all she said. I asked the group about the man who had given me the map as I was almost desperate to talk to him about the experience I had so I could compare it to his own. They told me that he had disappeared shortly after I had visited them the first time and had not been back. Strangely, when I tried to tell them what had happened to me, no one would let me tell the story, and the oldest man there who sat in the corner kept mumbling the words Yinalblushii. We all once again sat and shared other stories of life and a meal. Before I left the next morning, I found the old woman who had given me the talisman and offered it back to her. She smiled and told me I had a good heart, then just closed my hands around it, telling me to keep it to watch over my next walkabout. I went back to that small village on the reservation several times over the next 10 years or so till I moved to Oregon, but they never let me tell them what happened. I never went back to the canyon, and while curiosity sometimes gets the best of me, I don't think I ever will. Fourth story. I was in prison for 15 years. There was a Skinwalker in there with us. A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in southern Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important. During my stay there, There were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. Supposedly, years ago something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we'd be woken up, and expected to stand near the front of our cells while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of these routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off during this check. When a guard pulled over another guard to help him check it out, they found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. This man was wearing the skin of the other man over him. Loosely fitting, draped over him, apparently looked like a real monster. The scariest things were was the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into prison, let alone a cell. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that? They never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty grisly stuff, I know. And I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker, but that's what the prison called him. The Skinwalker. Didn't help that the guy never talked apparently. Anyway, that's what started the whole Skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone in Gen Pop felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now on to the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the Skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old lifer Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now, apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms are all off. They can mimic human speech but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking. But apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners. Slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even be able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. It had to be good, he posited one night. He would expect a skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it, and masterfully bided its time, as Carl thought, for years. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on edge about it. Every once in a while in prison, people snap. Sometimes you'll find your cellmate swinging in front of your bunk, strung up around the neck by his pant leg. Sometimes you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner, or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking. Hunch over and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front if their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker, or just people going crazy. But I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything, but every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple weeks before they were shipped off or transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there was the nighttime occurrences. Short, loud bursts of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig's dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows flit across my walls on a regular occasion, when there were definitely no guards near my cell. One time near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there, but when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was outside my cell. And the footsteps. Everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it was inhumanely fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated the footsteps. I agreed. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago, and I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a good friend of mine snapped. In the same kinda way. I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing? I woke up one night to him somehow snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. The worst part though, he was coming back into our cell. On the day of my release I didn't say a word to him. Just left. He seemed fine with it, so was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, Skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gates, a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, like he had for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence. I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl. Slouched over, eyeing the other inmates, and twitching manically. 5th story. Skinwalker. I won't reveal who I am, or much about where I live, and to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened. But I just came to terms with it now, and I have to warn people about what's out there, what they knew, what we don't. Warning, this is a very long read, and some of the content below is very disturbing. But I can't hold back. Here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people considered sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in a church. You don't let the American flag touch the ground. You don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway. And since no one else was going, he managed to goad me into going with him. That's another one of my hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. too many tragic news stories start that way. So, I ended up going with him, reluctantly. The whole way there he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he had been there before, though only once. His manipulative ploy had been to get me to come with, so he could show me. He admitted this all in the casual way that friends admit being asses to friends. Sometimes, I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourist knew about it, a lot of locals and even some you didn't know about it. But, if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping, or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to urinate. I stepped off of the main road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past a shallow creek, with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me as I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other end, I pulled my way through some trees, and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget, though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns and brush, but suddenly, it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil, and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer I saw things had been carved on them, symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around, as if they actually had been a perfect brick wall, and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only halfway over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on, and on. There were no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day, and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started getting really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we'd be walking these 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating lunch. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked, and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head, moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees, and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed that it was making far too much noise, and was doing so far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent. And we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back, and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something. But I didn't have time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off, or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me, because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time, it was funny. Hey! Buck! Yeah, you, horny motherfucker, leave us alone. He walked off the road, and disappeared down a ridge, behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. Mark? I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. Mark? I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far, I knew, because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there were signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees, and the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things, too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. Mark! I called out, furiously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward, along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine, with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it had hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. Mark? I murmured, then called out again, Mark. Something heard, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard a rustling, and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the foliage, and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please, give me a second. I've spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself this wasn't real. At first, I saw a head, the head of a buck. But it came forward, and I realized that it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared-looking, even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all like the horns of the average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized. A mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned, and naked, with very human genitalia. Its penis was dripping blood, just like its horns, implying things that I don't want to think of. I remember both its arms and its legs. They started human, but near the bottom they started distorting, and became animalistic. At the ends of its legs were powerful hooves. At the ends of its arms were hands with long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws, Mark's body was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment, there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then, the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body apathetically, and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang. Suddenly, it's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around, and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction of the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt, and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I had never run so fast, or so desperately, in all my life, but it was gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping that I was going the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack, and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it, slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow, I ran, and ran, and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore. But I didn't care. I kept running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail, and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up at the trail, at the point where it went up between two mountains, and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there, near the beginning of the trail, was the Skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail, and it didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition, floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me. Though I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in dreams, nightmares. That creature, the Skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite. Because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature, it isn't Mark's raped and mutilated corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle, left alone for so long, that had been quietly penetrated. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.